June 6, 1944. 6:30 in the morning. Utah Beach, Normandy. Major General Raymond Barton is standing aboard the USS Bayfield, 11 miles offshore, watching through binoculars as the first wave of his Fourth Infantry Division hits the sand. Barton is a careful man. A methodical man. The kind of officer who plans for every contingency and sleeps poorly when he cannot control the variables. And right now, the variable he cannot control is a 56-year-old Brigadier General with a bad heart and a cane who has just waded onto a beach that Barton was almost certain would kill him. Barton had said no twice. 2 verbal requests, each one rejected. The man was too old. He was too sick. His arthritis was so advanced he could not walk without a cane. His heart, though he had hidden the diagnosis from army doctors, was failing. He had no business being in the first wave of the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. He had no business being on a beach at all. His job, as assistant division commander, was to coordinate from a command post behind the lines, to supervise logistics, to manage the second and third waves. His job was emphatically not to wade through the surf with the 20-year-olds, carrying a pistol in one hand and a walking stick in the other, while German artillery carved the sand around him. And yet, when the man had submitted a written petition, a formal letter dated May 26, 1944, Barton had read it and found he could not refuse again. The letter said, in part, that the force and skill with which the first elements hit the beach might determine the ultimate success of the operation. It said that with troops going into combat for the first time, the behavior of those first moments would set the pattern for everything that followed. It said that he personally knew the officers and men of those advance units, and that his presence would steady them. The man who wrote that letter was Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Junior, the eldest son of a President of the United States. A man who had already fought in one World War, been gassed at Cantigny, shot through the knee at Soissons, and carried a limp for the rest of his life because of it. A man who had been relieved of his previous command in Sicily for, as his superior put it, loving the division too much. A man whose brother had been shot out of the sky over France in 1918. A man whose other brother had killed himself in uniform in Alaska in 1943. A man who had every reason not to be here, and no reason, except one, to insist. The reason was the one thing Barton could not argue with. Roosevelt believed that his presence, his physical body standing on the beach where the bullets were, would matter more to those green troops than any order he could issue from a ship. He believed that leadership, at its most basic, was not a title or a rank or a plan. It was a willingness to be in the place where the worst thing was happening when you did not have to be there. When Barton approved the request, he later told his staff that he did not expect Roosevelt to come back alive. When he said goodbye to him the night before the invasion, he believed he was saying goodbye for the last time. He was almost right. Roosevelt would survive the beach. He would survive 36 more days. And then, on the night of July 11th, 1944, in a captured German truck near a village called Meautis, his heart would stop, and the oldest Roosevelt son would die the way his father had always expected his sons to live, in uniform, in the field, having given everything he had to give, and then a little more. This is the story of that man, not the president's son, the one who spent his entire life trying to earn a name he had been given at birth, and who, in the end, earned it so completely that the men who saw him do it could not talk about it afterward without their voices breaking. To understand why a 56-year-old general with a cane walked onto Utah Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944, you have to understand the family that made him. And that family begins with a wound that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with shame. Theodore Roosevelt Senior, the 26th President of the United States, the man who charged up San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders, the man who embodied physical courage so completely that he once finished a campaign speech with an assassin's bullet still lodged in his chest, carried a private humiliation his entire life. His own father, Theodore Roosevelt I, had paid a substitute to fight in his place during the Civil War. It was legal, it was common among wealthy men. It was also, in the moral framework of the Roosevelt family, unforgivable. The elder Roosevelt never served. He stayed home and made money while other men died. And his son, the future president, never forgot it. That shame became the engine of everything. Theodore Sr. built his identity around physical courage, around the idea that a man who would not fight was not fully a man. He hunted, he boxed. He led men into combat in Cuba in 1898, charging uphill into Spanish rifle fire at the head of a regiment he had assembled himself. And when he had sons of his own, 4 of them, he raised every one of them with the same unspoken commandment. A Roosevelt fights. A Roosevelt leads from the front. A Roosevelt does not send other men where he is not willing to go himself. He did not teach them this with lectures. He taught them with what he called point-to-point walks, cross-country hikes, where the rule was simple. You go in a straight line. If there is a hill, you climb it. If there is a river, you swim it. If there is a wall, you go over it. You never go around anything. You never take the easy path. You go through. Ted, the eldest son, absorbed this more deeply than any of his brothers. He was the one who bore the name. He was the one the newspapers would always compare to his father. He was the one who, as a boy, he had walked beside his father to the Civil Service Commission office, while the president drew battle maps in the gutter with the tip of his umbrella and talked about leadership the way other fathers talked about the weather. He was the one, his mother later said, had always worried that he would not be worthy of the name he carried. When Eleanor, Ted's wife, told the president about this fear, the old man reportedly replied that he walked with his head higher because of his son. But the name was a weight, and the expectation attached to it would follow Ted Roosevelt for 60 years, through 2 world wars, through political defeat, through the loss of a brother, through the loss of another brother, through the slow collapse of his own body, all the way to a beach in France where he would finally, once and for all, put the question to rest. When the United States entered the First World War in April of 1917, all 4 Roosevelt sons volunteered. Ted, the eldest, received a reserve commission as a major and sailed with the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, attached to the 26th Infantry Regiment. He was 29 years old. What followed was an education in suffering that would mark the rest of his life. Before the fighting even began, Ted showed the kind of officer he was going to be. When Army logistics failed to deliver proper footwear for his battalion, he bought new combat boots for every man in his unit, out of his own pocket. It was not a grand gesture. It was a practical one. His men needed boots. The system had not provided them, so he provided them. It was the first time, but not the last, that Ted Roosevelt would look at a problem, decide that waiting for someone else to solve it was not acceptable, and solve it himself with whatever he had at hand. At Cantigny, in late May of 1918, in the first major American offensive of the war, Ted's battalion took and held the village against repeated German counterattacks. The assault was designed to prove that American troops could execute a coordinated attack against fortified German positions. It was a small operation by the standards of the Western Front, but its symbolic importance was enormous. If Cantigny failed, it would confirm every European assumption that American soldiers were enthusiastic amateurs incapable of real warfare. If it succeeded, it would announce that the United States Army had arrived as a fighting force. Ted's battalion succeeded. They took the village and held it against 3 determined German counterattacks over the next 2 days. During the fighting, he was gassed. The chemical agent burned his lungs and temporarily blinded him. He refused to leave his command. He stayed with his men, unable to see, breathing through damaged tissue, directing the defense by sound and by the reports of the sergeants around him. His Silver Star citation would later note that although gassed in the lungs and gassed in the eyes to blindness, Major Roosevelt refused to be evacuated and retained command of his battalion throughout the engagement. 2 months later, at Soissons, on July 19, 1918, he led the assault companies of his battalion in person. A German bullet struck him in the left knee. He continued to lead the attack. He was eventually carried off the field when he could no longer stand. His Distinguished Service Cross citation recorded that he personally led the assault companies of his battalion, and although wounded in the knee, refused to be evacuated until carried off the field. The wound left permanent damage. He would never again walk without pain. His left heel lost all feeling. The arthritis that would eventually cripple him began in that French field in the summer of 1918. While Ted was lying in a hospital, something happened that would shape the Roosevelt family forever. 5 days before Ted was shot at Soissons, on July 14, 1918, Bastille Day, his youngest brother Quentin was killed. Quentin was 20 years old. He had joined the Army Air Service and become a pursuit pilot with the 95th Aero Squadron. He had scored his first confirmed kill just 4 days earlier. On July 14th, during the Second Battle of the Marne, his aircraft was shot down behind German lines near the village of Chamery. He was struck twice in the head and died instantly. The Germans buried him with military honours. Reports from the time describe roughly 1,000 German soldiers standing in formation around the grave. They did it partly to honour Quentin's bravery and partly out of respect for his father, who, though a former enemy leader, was admired by the German officer corps for his personal courage. When the news reached Theodore Senior, he wrote that it was bitter that the young should die, but that there were things worse than death, and that nothing under heaven would have made him wish his sons had acted differently. Theodore Roosevelt Senior died less than 6 months later, in January of 1919, a broken man who had given his youngest boy to the war and did not recover from the gift. Ted came home from France with a limp, a chest full of medals, and a brother in the ground. He helped found the American Legion at its first caucus in Paris in March of 1919. He declined the nomination to be its first national commander because he wanted to keep the organization non-partisan and believed that a Roosevelt leading it would inevitably drag it into politics. He went into politics himself, winning a seat in the New York State Assembly. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Harding, the same post his father had held before the Spanish-American War, and the same post his distant cousin Franklin would also hold. In 1924, he ran for governor of New York. His cousin Eleanor, Franklin's wife, campaigned against him, following Ted across the state in a car fitted with a large papier-mâché teapot on the roof, linking him to the Teapot Dome scandal. Ted had been cleared of any wrongdoing, but the image was devastating. He lost the election. It was a humiliation he did not forget. President Hoover appointed him governor of Puerto Rico in 1929. Ted served there for 3 years and, by most accounts, served well. He learned Spanish, travelled the island extensively, and pushed for infrastructure improvements. He was then appointed Governor-General of the Philippines, where he served until Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in 1932, and the new administration recalled him. Ted returned to private life and became chairman of the board of American Express and a vice president of the publishing house Doubleday Doran. He was wealthy, he was respected, he was, by every outward measure, a successful man living a full life. But the name never let him rest. In every room he entered, he was the president's son. In every newspaper article, the comparison was there. And the wound he carried was not just the limp or the damaged lungs or the arthritic joints. It was the knowledge that his father had done the defining thing, the charge up San Juan Hill, the moment that turned Theodore Roosevelt from a politician into a legend, and that he, Ted, had not yet had his moment. He had fought bravely, he had been decorated, he had held positions of responsibility, but he had not done the thing that would make the name his own rather than his father's, the thing that would let people say Theodore Roosevelt and mean him. In 1941, at the age of 53, Ted Roosevelt asked to return to active duty. The United States was not yet at war, but he could see what was coming. Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall approved his request. Ted was given command of his old regiment, the 26th Infantry, back in the 1st Infantry Division. He was soon promoted to Brigadier General and made Assistant Division Commander. The 1st Division sailed for Europe in August of 1942 aboard the Queen Mary. In November, in Operation Torch, they hit the beaches of North Africa. The Central Task Force, with the 1st Division as its spearhead, drove toward the port of Oran on the Algerian coast. Ted was in the thick of it from the first hour. He earned a Silver Star for leading from the front in Tunisia, fighting across the same kind of terrain where Rommel's Afrika Korps had been shattering Allied units for a year. He went forward to positions where brigadier generals had no tactical reason to be, not because the situation demanded it, but because he believed his men deserved to see that the man sending them forward was willing to go forward himself. He became a distinctive figure among the troops. He wore a knitted wool cap instead of a helmet. He carried his cane everywhere, the same cane that was the legacy of the bullet that hit him at Soissons. He showed up at forward observation posts and machine gun nests and foxholes where privates were eating cold rations, and he sat down and ate with them and asked about their families and remembered their names the next time he came. The soldiers of the 1st Division, men who were fighting and dying in the North African desert, came to regard Roosevelt not as a general, but as something closer to a mascot, a lucky charm, an old man who had no business being there and whose presence made them feel that if he could take it, they could take it too. He earned a second Silver Star during the Tunisian campaign and the French Croix de Guerre. His reputation among the enlisted ranks grew. His reputation among the senior officer corps was more complicated. Some saw him as exactly the kind of leader the army needed, a man who understood that morale was not built in briefing rooms but in foxholes. Others saw him as undisciplined, too casual with the men, too willing to blur the line between officers and enlisted, too much a product of his own legend to function within a modern military hierarchy. In July of 1943, the 1st Division landed at Gela, Sicily, in Operation Husky. The fighting was brutal. German and Italian forces counterattacked with armor on the beachhead itself, and for several hours it was not clear that the landing would hold. Ted was on the beach through all of it. After the beachhead was secured, the division pushed inland through mountainous terrain. The battle for the hilltop town of Troina, in early August, was one of the hardest fought engagements of the entire Sicilian campaign. It took 6 days of close combat to take the town. German paratroopers and infantry held every ridge and every stone wall, and the 1st Division paid for every yard in blood. After the battle for Troina, both Ted and the division commander, Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, were relieved by Omar Bradley. The decision was controversial and remains debated by historians to this day. Bradley respected them both, but believed the division had become too informal, too undisciplined in its behavior behind the lines, too much a personal kingdom of Allen and Roosevelt, where the rules that applied to the rest of the army did not quite seem to apply to the Big Red One. The men of the 1st Division, who worshipped both Allen and Roosevelt, were furious. Bradley later wrote that Roosevelt had to go with Allen, for he too had sinned by loving the division too much. The phrase is revealing. Bradley did not accuse Roosevelt of incompetence or cowardice or poor judgment in battle. He accused him of loving his men too much, of being too close to them, of blurring the line between the officer and the soldier in a way that made the division fight like a pack of wolves, but act like a mob when the fighting stopped. The question it raised, whether a leader should be close to his men or above them, whether love for a unit makes it stronger or makes it ungovernable, would follow Roosevelt for the rest of the war. It was, for Ted, the lowest point of the war. He had been fired, not for incompetence, not for cowardice, but for caring too much about his men and not enough about the chain of command. He spent months in a kind of professional exile, serving as a liaison officer to the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy. He lobbied for a new combat assignment. He caught pneumonia and was hospitalized. His arthritis worsened. His heart, though he told no one, was deteriorating. By early 1944, Ted Roosevelt was a man the army did not quite know what to do with. He was too famous to sideline completely. He was too old and too broken to command a division. He was a brigadier general with a legendary name, a body that was falling apart, and an absolute refusal to stop fighting. In February of 1944, he was assigned to the Fourth Infantry Division under Major General Raymond Barton. The 4th Division was untested. It had never seen combat. It was about to be thrown into the largest amphibious invasion in history. And Ted Roosevelt, who had been told he was finished, who had been relieved, who could barely walk across a room without his cane, decided that he was going to land on that beach in the first wave if it was the last thing he ever did. It very nearly was. The night before D-Day, Ted wrote a letter to his wife Eleanor at their home in Oyster Bay. He told her that he would be going in with the assault wave, hitting the beach at H hour. He told her he was doing it because it was the way he could contribute the most. He wrote that it steadied the young men to know that he was with them, to see him plodding along with his cane. He did not tell her about his heart. He did not tell her that the doctors, had they known the truth, would never have cleared him for duty. He did not tell her what he almost certainly understood, which was that this beach might be the last thing he would see. At a pre-invasion staff conference, when Bradley told the assembled officers they would have ringside seats at the greatest fight in history, Ted leaned over to the man beside him and whispered a correction. He said that ringside was wrong. He said they would be in the arena. It was the kind of thing his father would have said. It was the kind of thing his father would have meant. June 6th, 1944, 6:30 in the morning. The ramp of the landing craft drops, and Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Junior steps into the surf at Utah Beach. He is 56 years old. He is the oldest man on the beach. He is the only general officer in the entire Allied invasion force to land by sea in the first wave. He is carrying a pistol in one hand and a cane in the other. He is wearing no insignia of rank. As a soldier tries to help him over the side, he waves the man off and growls in his deep voice to get the hell out of his way. When his boots hit the sand, the first thing he notices is that something is wrong. The landmarks do not match the maps. The beach exits are not where they should be. The dunes are shaped differently. The fortifications he was briefed on are not visible. Within minutes, he understands. The strong tidal currents and the loss of 3 of the 4 control craft to mines have pushed the entire first wave roughly a mile south of the planned landing zone. They are on the wrong beach. They are supposed to be near Exit 3, the causeway that would take them through the flooded fields behind the dunes and into the village of Ordouville-la-Hubert. Instead, they are near Exit 2, closer to the hamlet of La Grande Dune. In any military operation, landing in the wrong place is a potential catastrophe. The follow-on waves are planned for the original location. The naval fire support is registered on targets near the original beaches. The engineers have charts for obstacles at the original site. If the first wave stays where it is and the second wave lands where it is supposed to, the 2 forces will be separated by a mile of open beach under German fire. If the first wave tries to move north to the planned position, it will be exposed and out of position for hours. If the first wave does nothing, the entire operation stalls. Roosevelt makes the decision in minutes. He personally reconnoiters the area behind the beach, walking with his cane through terrain that has not been cleared of mines, under sporadic German fire from the strongpoints on the bluffs. He locates Exit 2. He determines that it is usable. He returns to the beach and finds the 2 battalion commanders, Lieutenant Colonels Conrad Simmons and Carlton McNeely, and the 8th Infantry Regimental Commander, Colonel James Van Fleet. He tells Van Fleet they are not where they are supposed to be. Then he says the words that will become the most famous sentence of the Utah Beach landing. He says they will start the war from right here. It is not a request. It is not a suggestion. It is a decision made by a man who has the authority to make it, the experience to know it is right, and the physical presence on the ground to enforce it. He is the ranking officer on the beach. He is the only one who has seen the terrain behind it. He is the only one who can make the call. He makes it. For the rest of the morning, Roosevelt moves up and down the beach like a man who has forgotten that he is 56 years old and dying. He meets every incoming wave of troops. He stands at the exits and directs units inland like a traffic officer at a busy intersection, pointing with his cane, shouting over the noise of explosions, greeting men by name when he knows them, and by unit when he does not. An engineer named Cassidy, planting demolition charges near the seawall, spots him and yells for somebody to knock that man down before he gets killed, not realizing the man is a general. Captain George Mabry of the 2nd Battalion sees him waving his cane and urging new arrivals to keep moving forward. Lieutenant Joseph Owen recalls Roosevelt slowing his jeep to yell a cheerful warning that there was shooting up ahead, and then laughing about it. He is not performing. This is the thing that every account from that morning makes clear. He is not acting brave. He is not putting on a show for the men. He is simply doing what he has always believed leadership requires, which is being there, being visible, being calm when the situation demands panic. Being the man who walks toward the thing everyone else is running from, not because he does not feel fear, but because the men around him need to see someone who is not afraid, and he has decided, as he decided at Cantigny and Soissons and Tunisia and Sicily, that the someone is going to be him. The decision to start the war from right here would prove to be one of the most consequential snap judgments of the entire invasion. The accidental landing zone turned out to be more lightly defended than the planned one. The German strongpoints near Exit 3 were formidable, part of a defensive network that had been under construction for more than 2 years. The ones near Exit 2 were weaker, manned by elements of the 709th Static Infantry Division under General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben. The 709th was not a frontline fighting formation. It was a coastal defense unit, one of dozens the Germans had strung along the Atlantic Wall to hold ground that the Wehrmacht could not afford to garrison with quality troops. Its ranks were filled with older soldiers, men recovering from wounds sustained on the Eastern Front, and so-called Ostlegionen, non-German conscripts drawn from occupied Soviet territories, including Georgians, Armenians, and former prisoners of war who had been given a choice between service in the Wehrmacht and death in a camp. These men had little motivation to fight for a country that had conquered theirs. Their equipment was outdated. They had almost no motor transport. Their best officers and NCOs had already been stripped away and sent to the Eastern Front, where the real killing was being done. The German command structure on the morning of June 6th was in chaos for reasons that had nothing to do with Roosevelt's landing. The massive Allied airborne drops, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula in the hours before dawn, had confused the German chain of command. Reports were contradictory. Nobody was sure where the main attack was coming. The elaborate Allied deception operations, particularly the Phantom 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by Patton, had convinced many German generals that Normandy was a feint and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. Reserves that could have been rushed to the beaches were held back. Panzer divisions that could have counterattacked at dawn were kept in place because nobody at the highest levels was willing to commit them without confirmation that this was the real thing. All of which meant that when Roosevelt made his decision to start the war where they were, the forces opposing him were weaker, more disorganized, and more confused than anyone on the American side could have known. The mislanding, which should have been a disaster, became an advantage, and Roosevelt, the man who recognized it, exploited it, and organized the response, became the reason it worked. Meautis Beach would become the most successful of the 5 D-Day landings. By the end of June 6th, more than 20,000 troops and 1,700 vehicles had come ashore. The 4th Division suffered only 197 casualties that day, including 60 men lost at sea when part of Battery B of the 29th Field Artillery Battalion sank on the crossing. By comparison, Omaha Beach, 5 miles to the east, cost more than 2,000 casualties in the same hours. The difference was partly geography, partly the weakness of the German defenders, and partly the fact that a 56-year-old man with a cane had looked at a situation that should have been a catastrophe and turned it into an advantage before most of the men on the beach had finished being afraid. While Ted Roosevelt was wading ashore at Utah, his son, Captain Quentin Roosevelt II, was landing at Omaha Beach with the 1st Infantry Division, the same division his father had been relieved from less than a year earlier. They were the only father and son to land on D-Day. Ted knew his boy was on another beach that morning. He did not know if his boy was alive. He would not find out for 2 days. When General Barton finally came ashore later that day, Roosevelt met him near La Grande Dune. Barton later wrote about that moment with an emotion that is visible even through the formal language of a military memoir. He said that Roosevelt had landed with the first wave, had put his troops across the beach, and had a perfect picture of the entire situation. He said that when he had agreed to let Roosevelt land with the assault force, he had felt certain Roosevelt would be killed. He said that when he had said goodbye, he had never expected to see him alive. He wrote simply that he loved Ted. Omar Bradley, when asked years later to name the single most heroic action he had personally witnessed in the entire war, did not hesitate. He said it was Ted Roosevelt on Meautis Beach. After June 6th, there was no rest. The 4th Division pushed inland through the Norman hedgerows, the bocage country where every field was a fortress, and every hedge concealed a machine gun nest. The bocage was terrain that no amount of planning had prepared the Americans for. The hedgerows were ancient, some of them centuries old, earthen banks 4 feet high, topped with dense tangles of trees and brush that reached 15 feet. The root systems went 3 to 12 feet deep, turning each bank into a natural fortification. Every rectangular field, some no more than 300 feet across, was a separate defensive position. A machine gun team behind one hedgerow could cover the entire field in front of it. When the Americans broke through one hedge, there was another one waiting 50 yards ahead. The fighting was intimate and relentless. Men died in fields so small you could throw a rock across them. The advance was measured not in miles but in hedgerows, and the cost per hedgerow was appalling. In some divisions, the casualty rates in the bocage exceeded anything experienced per yard of advance in the First World War. The 4th Division pushed through it all, relieving the 82nd Airborne at Sainte-Mère-Église and driving north up the Cotentin Peninsula toward the port city of Cherbourg, which the Allies desperately needed to sustain the invasion. The fighting for Cherbourg was house to house, room to room, as German defenders fought to deny the port as long as possible. General von Schlieben surrendered the city on June 26th, though the last harbour fortifications held out until June 29th. In the first 3 weeks after D-Day, the Fourth Division suffered more than 5,400 casualties, with over 800 men killed. Through all of it, Roosevelt was at the front. He rode in a jeep he had named Rough Rider, after his father's famous regiment from the Spanish-American War. He visited forward positions daily, often arriving at company command posts where the fighting was still ongoing. He talked to privates. He ate with enlisted men. He sat in muddy foxholes and asked men what they needed, and then went back to make sure they got it. He ignored the pain in his joints, the pain that was now constant, a deep, grinding ache in his hips and knees and shoulders that made every step an act of will. He ignored the tightening in his chest that came more frequently now, a pressure that squeezed the air out of him at unexpected moments and left him grey-faced and short of breath. He ignored the headaches that were getting worse every day, headaches so severe that they sometimes blurred his vision. When Cherbourg fell at the end of June, he served briefly as military governor of the city, setting up his headquarters in a cellar lit by a single oil lamp. He worked to restore order, to organize the clearance of the harbour, which the Germans had sabotaged with demolitions and sunken ships, and to establish civil authority in a city that had been fought over for days. His aide, Lieutenant Marcus Stevenson, watched him deteriorate. The constant rain of Normandy soaked through his clothes and never dried. He was not sleeping. He was losing weight. The arthritis had spread from his knee to his hips and shoulders. His hands shook, but he would not go to the rear. He would not see a doctor. He would not stop. What none of them knew, what Roosevelt himself may not have fully understood, was that his heart was failing. The damage from the gas attack at Cantigny 26 years earlier had weakened his cardiovascular system. The arthritis, the stress, the physical punishment of 5 weeks of continuous combat at an age when most men were sitting behind desks, all of it was pulling him toward a collapse that no amount of willpower could prevent. On July 11, 1944, Roosevelt spent the day at the front with his men, as he had every day since the landing. That evening, he returned to his headquarters near the village of Meautis, a captured German command truck that served as his sleeping quarters. His son, Quentin, came to visit. They spent roughly 2.5 hours together. It was the last time they would speak. During the visit, Ted confided something he had told almost no one. He said he had been having recurring pains in his chest and head. He had been hiding them. Quentin left. About an hour later, around 10 in the evening, Roosevelt suffered a massive heart attack. Medical attendants worked to revive him. General Barton arrived around 11:30 and found him barely conscious. Roosevelt died shortly before midnight. He was 56 years old. He had survived the beach by 36 days. On that same day, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had selected Roosevelt for promotion to Major General and command of the 90th Infantry Division, a unit whose leadership had faltered in Normandy and which needed exactly the kind of officer Roosevelt was. Eisenhower had approved. The orders were being drawn up. Roosevelt died without ever knowing. His son Quentin wrote to his mother Eleanor the next morning. His words were brief and devastating. He wrote that the lion was dead. He wrote that to him, Ted had been much more than a father. He had been an amazing combination of father, brother, friend, and comrade in battle. General George Patton recorded in his diary that Teddy Roosevelt had died in his sleep the previous night. He noted that Roosevelt had made 3 assault landings with the leading wave. Patton called him one of the bravest men he had ever known. Such is fate, he wrote, and nothing more. The funeral was held on July 14, 1944, Bastille Day. The same day, 26 years earlier, that Ted's brother Quentin had been shot down and killed over France in the First World War. The coincidence was not lost on anyone who knew the family. An army band played the hymn called "The Son of God Goes Forth to War" as artillery rumbled in the distance. The honorary pallbearers were Generals Omar Bradley, George Patton, J. Lawton Collins, Clarence Hubner, Raymond Barton, and Courtney Hodges. Riflemen fired 3 volleys and 2 buglers sounded taps in echo fashion, one close and one far away. Barton, who had watched Roosevelt wade onto that beach 5 weeks earlier, believing he would never see him alive again, stood at the graveside and later wrote that Roosevelt was the most gallant soldier and finest gentleman he had ever known. Roosevelt was initially buried in the temporary American cemetery near Sainte-Mère Église, a few miles from Utah Beach. In 1948, when the temporary cemeteries were consolidated, his remains were moved to the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleyville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach. He rests at Plot D, row 28, grave 45. And here is the part that stops you when you read it. In 1955, the family requested that Quentin Roosevelt, Ted's youngest brother, the fighter pilot killed in 1918, be reinterred beside him. Quentin's remains were moved from his original grave near Chamery, where the Germans had buried him with military honors 37 years earlier, to the Normandy American Cemetery. He is the only soldier from the First World War buried in that Second World War cemetery. The decision required special authorization because the cemetery had been established exclusively for the fallen of the Second World War. But the family made the request, and the army granted it, and so the two Roosevelt brothers now lie side by side beneath identical white crosses, killed in two different world wars, 26 years apart. Buried together in the soil of a country their father had taught them it was their duty to defend. The Normandy American Cemetery sits on a bluff above Omaha Beach. It covers 172 acres of land that the French government granted to the United States in perpetuity. More than 9,300 American soldiers are buried there. The rows of white crosses and stars of David stretch across manicured grass that overlooks the same water those men crossed on the morning that changed the century. Ted's grave is among the most visited in the cemetery. Visitors leave coins on his headstone. They leave flowers. They leave notes. Some of them stand there for a long time without saying anything. Next to him, in the grave, the family requested, lies Quentin. His cross bears the dates of a different war and a different death, but the same last name. The two of them rest there together, as close in death as they had been in the nursery at San Juan Hill, where their father had once drawn battle maps on the floor and told them stories about men who did not go around obstacles but went through them. There is something that Bradley said about Roosevelt that deserves to be repeated, not because it is new information, but because of who said it. Bradley was not a man given to superlatives. He was called the soldier's general precisely because he was quiet, careful, and reluctant to elevate any individual above the collective effort. When he was asked, years after the war, to name the single most heroic action he had witnessed in combat, he could have named any number of extraordinary things he had seen across North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Bulge, and the drive into Germany. He chose Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach. He also wrote that he had never known a braver man or a more devoted soldier. Barton, who had tried to keep Roosevelt off the beach and failed, who had approved the written petition against his own judgment and his own heart, who had stood on the bayfield watching through binoculars as a 56-year-old man limped into the surf with a cane and a pistol, said it more simply. He said that when Roosevelt came out to meet him on the beach, he was bursting with information. He said that Roosevelt had put his troops across the beach and had a perfect picture of the entire situation before Barton had even finished forming his first order. He said he loved Ted. And then he said that when he had let him go, he had never expected to see him alive again. Patton, who was not a man who admired many people, and who was constitutionally incapable of saying something kind unless he meant it completely, called Roosevelt one of the bravest men he had ever known. Coming from Patton, who had stood in the turret of a tank under fire in North Africa, and who would drive his Third Army across France at a speed that terrified his own staff, this was not small praise. Eisenhower approved the Medal of Honor. Barton had originally recommended the Distinguished Service Cross, but higher headquarters elevated it. The medal was presented to Ted's widow Eleanor by Secretary of War Henry Stimson at the Pentagon on September 21, 1944. The citation reads that Roosevelt repeatedly led groups from the beach, over the seawall, and established them inland. It says his valor, courage, and presence in the very front of the attack, and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire, inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice. It says that under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strong points and rapidly moved inland with minimum casualties. It says he thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. When the Medal of Honor was approved, President Franklin Roosevelt, Ted's fifth cousin and lifelong political rival, reportedly remarked to Eleanor that Ted's father would have been the proudest of all. It was a generous thing to say from a man who had spent 20 years on the opposite side of the Roosevelt family divide. And it was true, because in 2001, more than a century after the battle, President Theodore Roosevelt Sr. was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for his charge at San Juan Hill on July 1, 1898. The medal was presented by President Bill Clinton to Tweed Roosevelt and the family in the Roosevelt Room of the White House. With that award, the Roosevelts became one of only two father and son pairs in American history to both receive the Medal of Honor. The other pair is Arthur MacArthur and Douglas MacArthur. The son had spent his whole life chasing the father's shadow. In the end, they stood together in the same light. But the story of the Roosevelt family in uniform does not end with Ted and his father. It continues through every branch and every generation, and the cost of the family creed that a Roosevelt fights, that a Roosevelt goes through and never around, was paid not by one son but by all of them. Archibald Roosevelt, known as Archie, the third son, served with the 1st Division in the First World War. At Soissons, near the same ground where Ted was shot, Archie was hit by shrapnel that shattered his kneecap and broke his arm. He was discharged with a full disability rating. He earned 2 Silver Stars and the French Croix de Guerre. When the Second World War began, Archie went back. He served as a lieutenant colonel, commanding a battalion of the 162nd Infantry in New Guinea. On August 12, 1943, a Japanese grenade shattered the same knee that had been destroyed by shrapnel in France 25 years earlier. He became the only American soldier in history to be declared 100% disabled for the same wound in 2 different wars. A ridge in New Guinea was named Roosevelt Ridge in his honor. He was the only one of the 4 brothers who survived both wars. He lived to 1979. Kermit Roosevelt, the second son, served with the British Army in Mesopotamia during the First World War, and again with the British in Norway and Egypt, early in the Second. He transferred to the United States Army, but he carried a darkness that the family name could not cure. He battled depression and alcoholism for most of his adult life. In 1943, posted to Fort Richardson, Alaska, medically unfit for duty and in despair, Kermit took his own life on June 4th. He was 53 years old. His death was initially reported to his mother as a heart attack. The family did not speak publicly about the truth for decades. 4 sons went to war. 3 of them did not survive it. 1 was killed in combat at 20 years old. 1 was consumed by a despair. The war deepened until he could not carry it any longer. 1 gave his body to 2 wars until his heart, damaged by gas and by decades of pushing through pain, simply stopped. The 4th was wounded so badly, twice, in the same leg, in 2 different wars, that he spent the rest of his life in pain. The creed their father taught them, that a Roosevelt goes through, cost the family everything a family can give. And Ted, the eldest, the one who bore the name, gave more than any of them except Quentin. He gave his health. He gave his career. He gave his comfort and his safety, and finally his life, not in a single dramatic moment on the beach, but in the slow grinding expenditure of a body that had been damaged at Cantigny and Soissons and had never fully recovered, pushed past its limit by a man who believed that being present with his soldiers was worth more than being alive without them. There is a question that runs underneath this entire story, the way a current runs beneath the surface of a river. The question is this: why did he go to the beach? He did not have to. No one would have blamed a 56-year-old brigadier general with arthritis and a heart condition for staying on the ship. No one would have questioned it. No one would have even noticed. The battle would have been fought. The beach would have been taken. The war would have been won. Theodore Roosevelt Junior could have watched Utah Beach from the deck of the Bayfield through binoculars, the way his division commander did, and no history book would have recorded his absence. He had already proven himself. He had fought in 1 world war. He had been wounded twice. He had been decorated for valor multiple times. He had served in North Africa and Sicily. He had nothing left to prove to anyone except, perhaps, himself. And even that is too simple an explanation, because the men who knew him best, the men who had served with him in Tunisia and at Gala and in the hedgerows, did not describe a man who was trying to prove something. They described a man who simply could not bear to be anywhere else when his soldiers were in danger. There is a difference between courage and recklessness, and the difference is purpose. A reckless man takes risks because he does not care what happens to him. A courageous man takes risks because he cares what happens to the people around him more than he cares what happens to himself. Roosevelt's petition to Barton was not the letter of a man seeking glory. It was the letter of a man who had watched enough young soldiers go into combat for the first time to know that the first minutes would determine everything, and who believed, with the conviction of 30 years of military experience, that his physical presence in those first minutes would save lives. He was right. The men on Utah Beach that morning, thousands of them, had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were draftees and volunteers in a regular army division, boys from small towns and cities who had trained for months in England and who were now jumping off the ramps of landing craft into the cold water of the English Channel, with the sound of explosions around them and the knowledge that the beach ahead of them might be the last ground they ever touched. They were looking for something to hold on to, not a plan, not an order, a person, someone who looked like he knew what he was doing, someone who was not afraid, someone who was walking toward the thing they were all terrified of, and walking calmly, as if this were just another day and just another problem to be solved. Roosevelt gave them that person. He gave them the sight of a 56-year-old man with a cane and a pistol walking through the surf as if he were on a Sunday stroll, calling out to men by name, waving them forward, pointing with his cane toward the dunes, making jokes under fire, looking for all the world as if there were nowhere on earth he would rather be than exactly where he was. It was not an act, or if it was an act, it was the deepest kind, the kind where a man has played a role so long and so completely that the role and the man have become the same thing. That is not strategy, that is not tactics, that is not doctrine, that is something older and simpler. It is the decision that what matters most is not the plan, not the rank, not the name on the door, but the willingness to stand in the same mud, under the same fire, facing the same fear, as the men you have asked to follow you. It is the decision that leadership is not something you exercise from a distance. It is something you prove with your presence. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of men like Theodore Roosevelt Junior visible a little longer. Men who did not seek fame, men who did not seek comfort. Men who decided that the price of the name they carried was that they would always be in the hardest place, doing the hardest thing, not because someone ordered them to, but because they could not live with themselves if they did not. Ted Roosevelt is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery, Plot D, Row 28, Grave 45. His brother Quentin is beside him. 2 white crosses, 2 wars, 2 brothers who went through and never around. If your father or grandfather served in the Second World War, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit did they serve in? Where were they? What did they remember? Those details matter. They are the real record, and they deserve to be kept alive by the people who carry them. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this. Not the stories that flatter us, not the ones that simplify, the ones that happened, with the names, the dates, the wounds, and the choices that made ordinary men into something the rest of us spend our lives trying to understand. Roosevelt did not die on the beach. He died 36 days later in a truck near a village most people have never heard of, from a heart that had been failing since a gas attack in France in 1918. He did not die in the full flush of action. He died in his sleep, quietly, after a long day at the front and a visit from his son. But the thing he did on the beach, the thing that Bradley called the most heroic action he had ever seen, was not the dying, it was the going, it was the decision to be there. It was the cane, and the pistol, and the surf, and the words that no one who heard them ever forgot. We will start the war from right here. He did. And they did. And the war was won. And the man who said it was gone 5 weeks later. And his brother, who had fallen from the sky 26 years before, was brought to lie beside him. And the 2 of them rest there still, in French soil, above a beach where the world changed, under crosses that say only their names and the dates, and nothing about what they actually did. But the men who were there knew. And now you know too.